and thank you for joining us. Thank you for joining us today on the opening event of our Spring 2021 series on strengthening legacy cities. We have a great panel today of a real all-star panel of people from Ohio to talk about some of the challenges facing post-industrial legacy cities across the state. Before we introduce the panel, I just want to talk about the other two events in our series this semester. On Friday, February 12th, we'll have Alan Malik, the author of Divided City, about social polarization in legacy cities, and a very good book. I recommend it. And that will be Friday, February 12th at noon. And then on Friday, March 12th at noon, we're having Charles Marone from strongtowns.org, author of the book Strong Towns, A Bottom-Up Revolution to Restore American, I forget the rest of that title, but also another very good book. And they're both going to be talking about how do we strengthen legacy cities and how do we build more resilient cities in Ohio and beyond. So I encourage you to attend both those events. Go to cura.osu.edu to register for both events. Even if you can't make them on time, we'll send you a link afterwards to the recording. Also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. So let's start with today's panel on strengthening legacy cities in Ohio and beyond. And I'll introduce our panelists. Again, this is an all-star panel from across Ohio. We'll start with Ian Beniston. He is the executive director of the Youngstown Neighborhood Development Corporation and has been part of that organization since it was conceived in 2008. He is responsible for the Youngstown Neighborhood Development Corporation's consistent achievement of its mission and day-to-day operations. He holds a master's in city regional planning from The Ohio State University and a Bachelor of Arts in Sociology from Youngstown State University. He is a member of the American Institute of Certified Planners and a National Development Council Housing Development Finance Professional. Thank you for joining us today, Ian. Tony Richardson. In 2011, Tony Richardson was elected as a council member at large for the city of Lorain, becoming the youngest person of color elected for an at-large seat in the city's history. During his term, Anthony served as chairman of the Police, Fire, and Legislative Standing Committee and sponsored legislation to increase hiring goal percentages for racial minorities and women on city projects. He was also invited by the Obama administration to attend a working meeting on fiscal cliff meeting at the White House. In 2015, Anthony joined the Nord Family Foundation and is now the executive director. He holds a bachelor's degree from Oberlin College and a Juris Doctorate from The Ohio State University Moritz College of Law. Thanks for joining us today, Tony. Allison Goebel is the executive director of the Great Ohio Policy Center and has been with the GOPC since 2010. Allison is responsible for charting GOPC's strategic direction, directing the research, advocacy, and outreach teams, and securing resources for this work. She is author of a number of research reports and policy briefs related to revitalization of weak market legacy cities, transportation funding, and local governance structures in Ohio. Allison is a graduate and board member of Leadership Ohio and was elected by her class to the 2014 Leader Among Leaders Award. Congratulations for that. She holds a PhD and master's in anthropology from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and a BA from Miami University. I assume that's the one in Ohio, Allison. Yes, the good one. And finally, Jason Sagetti. He's the Director of Planning and Urban Development for the city of Akron, Ohio. Jason has worked in the urban planning field for the past 25 years and is an avid writer on urban planning and development. He blogs at Notes from the Underground. He is also currently serving as the inaugural Legacy Cities Fellow with the Economic Innovation Group, where he writes about challenges and opportunities in the older industrial cities of the Great Lakes region. And he has 2 degrees in geography, a bachelor's from the University of Akron and a master's from University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Again, Jason, thanks for joining us. So what we'll do is we'll have some opening comments from the panelists, and we will start with Jason.
Well, thanks a lot for having me, and it's great to be with this esteemed group of colleagues this afternoon, this Friday afternoon, and thanks to everybody out there joining us. I wish we could see you in person, but I know that time is going to come soon. So I just wanted to start with outlining, a little bit of our experience here in Akron and talk a little bit about how it interfaces with some of the national issues. So My boss, Mayor Horrigan, made an intentional decision when he was elected in 2016 to, I guess what I would call reject the idea of managed decline. And it wasn't that we don't want to be realistic about the future of our city, and we recognize some of the challenges that are out there, but we do think we have a lot of opportunities to grow and develop. We launched a citywide tax abatement program that's borne a lot of fruit in terms of increasing the supply of housing in the city. And I think one of the other issues I just wanted to share before I turn it over to the other panelists is I think one of the challenges in legacy cities today is also that no matter how much they do right at the local level, there are a lot of national issues that are out there. I'm thinking especially in terms of some of the federal programs and federal policy, both around community development block grant. I think there's some reform opportunities there to help middle neighborhoods in particular. And I think also with antitrust legislation and things that could help cities compete. We've lost a lot of institutions locally, banks, newspapers, things that are kind of part of the civic fabric of a lot of these places. And although I think there's a lot cities can do locally, I've worked in local government for a long time now, and most certainly believe in the importance of that and local leadership. But I do think that in addition to that, we're only as strong as some of the backup we get from the state and the national government. And I think especially in today's day and age, and I think the 2020 election, I won't go down that rabbit hole any further than to just say, I think it did bring out even more issues on the national consciousness about the disparities that we're seeing increasingly between different geographic areas in the country, the concentration of wealth and capital in opportunity in a smaller and smaller number of places. And I've been a pretty outspoken opponent of the idea that the way to help these places is just to encourage everyone to move away. I don't see that really. It may help some people, and I'm always quick to add, it's not that I mean, we all are from Ohio, right? It's not that we don't know that people can move away for opportunity, and that can be for any individual, I think, a really important strategy. But in terms of a place-based economic development policy, the other point I would just make quickly is that a lot of Ohio cities, even mid-size or smaller cities, are still pretty large places that won't just disappear. So I think that kind of fatalistic idea that we can just encourage everyone to move and things will take care of itself, I think that's proving to be not a very good economic development strategy. So I'm sure we can unpack some of that throughout the rest of the discussion, but that was kind of what I'd like to add just to frame our conversation to begin with.
Okay, thank you, Jason. Tony, what's your perspective?
Yeah, thank you. And thanks again for inviting me to be a part of this esteemed panelist. And also I want to thank folks who are tuning in on this webinar for taking time to be a part and join us as we unpack. Obviously, none of us have the silver bullet or answer to revitalizing some of our legacy cities, but I mean, these are just ideas, thoughts, practices, tried and true, things that we've come across, and just, an opportunity to, again, be amongst people who are in the work. And so I wanted to, hold space for that just because I was in city government, but now am at a foundation. And so when I came to the foundation, I didn't lose my elected councilman hat, right, or perspective or glasses when I came to the foundation. And one of the things I learned really quickly was the amount of money, philanthropic money that was going into our communities that wasn't necessarily aligned with the strategic directive or directions of city government or local government, right? And so what I quickly thought was important was that we get on the same page, right? So we were saying we had missions aligned in terms of cities goals, county goals. There was a lot of alignment there, but for some reason we weren't sitting down together as co-investors in community and thinking about ways to leverage each other's resources. We know a lot of dollars that come from that are at the city level are restricted in some ways. And so philanthropy has a lot of flexibility in terms of what we can fund that government necessarily can't fund, but need to move an agenda or a project forward. So really leveraging existing philanthropies. And if you don't obviously have foundations in your community, there are other statewide institutions as well as national foundations that do a lot of work in your space. And that was really helpful, right? Because we also leveraged existing dollars that were in our community, but also dollars that were outside because of our relationships in national philanthropy. But as I think about the city of Lorain, again, which again, all these legacy cities have different like assets and strengths and weaknesses. We don't have huge four-year college institutions, research institutions, but we do have like the Black River, we have Lake Erie, we have other natural resources that we try to leverage to really revitalize our community. There's been big efforts in our community around housing stability. And point of sale, which actually was just rescinded by this existing council, but it was a way to stabilize our housing stock because we saw that homes were being flipped and there was no accountability to renters whose homes were being sold in like sort of these quick transactions to other property holders. And so again, just taking a step back, thinking about how are we growing our talent, attracting talent, retaining talent, really supporting our CDCs and providing resources in a way that allows them to have flexibility. So a lot of general operating support to our CDCs. And then collaborating with similarly situated legacy cities to share best practices, network, create shared visions and platforms, similar to the work that Greater Ohio Policy Center is doing with the Reinvention Cities Network. We were really early on with that just because we realized that, in order for us to come back as a community, we have to leverage the voice and amplify the voices of other similarly situated communities so that we can have a statewide and a national sort of voice. And then how do we leverage that to influence public policy? I think Jason made a great point around I don't want to misquote you, Jason, so I apologize if I butcher this, but this idea of legacy cities functioning or existing in an ecosystem where there's other state and national policy that impacts what happens at the ground level. But if we can sort of unite as a continuum or a group of a network of legacy cities, we just have more strength in numbers, and that's why we got behind that work. And that's pretty much it for now. I'm sure you'll ask me other questions later.
Great, Tony, thanks. Allison,
Sure.
give us the big picture from GOPC
Sure.
PC perspective, sorry.
No, you're fine. I know it's a mouthful. So thanks again for the invitation. It's great to be with friends and colleagues here, and it's just so exciting to see so many participants in the participant numbers. That gives me real hope that and knowledge that there's an army of interest and energy behind this topic. So the Greater Ohio Policy Center, just real briefly, we're a small nonprofit working statewide with a vision to revitalize Ohio. And so a lot of our work really majority of our work focuses on helping Ohio's legacy cities really revitalize and become vibrant, continue to build on the vibrancy that they have, to become places that people want to stay, live, work, and play in. So, and they already are, but as you know, we know about legacy cities, they've lost population and they've lost industry, and so we're trying to help them reinvent. For us, it's really important that the state policy context in which our cities are operating in is supportive. And in Ohio, it ranges from agnostic to hostile, and Jason and both Tony have sort of touched on that. And so day to day, that is our work. We have lobbyists on staff here who are at the General Assembly and the administrative offices, really trying to ensure that policies that are in place here can help our communities thrive. The other work that we do here is helping to build capacity of local leaders. So there's a lot of great leaders who are dedicated and passionate about their communities, but they don't exactly know how to navigate the system. They don't exactly know how to layer together programs. And that is, part of just sort of the function of decades-long brain drain, and also just a reduction in resources within local government and nonprofits. So not a criticism of those leaders on the ground, but just a reality of sort of the ecosystem. So our work includes helping to really kind of rebuild those skills and and provide as much assistance there as possible. So one way we do that is, as Tony was starting to describe, we do steward a number of communities of practice, including one that we call the Reinvention Cities Network, which is for the small legacy cities in the state to do peer learning, and then also to really serve as an advocacy block at the state level. Our work, so we are Ohio's smart growth organization, although we typically talk about our work in terms of economic development and revitalization, and less about conservation and sort of the environmental elements of smart growth. And that's sort of a strategic decision that my board made early on. But I do want to just say that we are certainly cognizant that one major component of where Ohio is today is because we've had we have developed faster than our population has. And so that mismatch of the physical environment to population really presents a number of challenges, but also opportunities for our communities. I guess the only other thing I would say is that with our communities that we see turning around, and I think we'll talk about this more here in a second, is that they have really owned the problems and owned the solutions and are not necessarily looking to state and feds to save them. They're looking to the state and feds for support, but and tools, but we often hold up those communities that are charting their own path because we think that right now, at least in Ohio, that is the most successful, sustainable way forward. So I'm going to stop here, let Ian introduce himself. We love the work that Ian and YNDC are doing in Youngstown, and I think Ian and everyone else here is going to have a lot of really important perspectives on the legacy city world here in Ohio.
Okay, that was a nice introduction by Allison. Ian, go ahead.
Sure. Greetings from Youngstown, and go Buckeyes. I know this is an Ohio State panel and I'm a graduate, so I'm obligated to say that, but I think I'll keep it brief. Everyone hit on a lot of the things I was thinking about. Certainly, to do what we need to do, there needs to be state and federal policy change, but here in Youngstown, we're certainly not waiting for that. I did want to give just a little bit of context about Youngstown and then how that relates to the work and the things that I'll say, but also legacy cities in general. And if you're not familiar with Youngstown, you need to understand that it's kind of on the end of the spectrum in terms of distress in legacy cities. We're a city with infrastructure for 250,000 people, and we currently have about 60,000 people living in the city. So that's kind of where I come from with all the things that I'll say during this time. The other thing I want to say about that, even when we talk about legacy cities, there's so much variation and diversity within that term, and we have very small cities, large cities, and a broad range of distress, as well as I heard my fellow panelists mention varying assets, whether that be university or eds and meds. Tony mentioned the Black River and Lake Erie and Lorraine. So there's a broad range of assets. There's a broad range of distress. Those things are important when we're talking about strategies and how the city is going to reinvent or revitalize itself. There is no one size fits all things. And even within the kind of this topic of legacy cities, what and how we do things, particularly, and I come from what I consider a smaller legacy city. I would characterize Lorraine as that too. We don't have the resources of a Cleveland or even an Akron where Jason is, and that makes our approach perhaps a little bit different. So as we go throughout the panel, those are the things I'll try to focus on.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so something that came up during your opening remarks, I think everyone touched upon it, was the fact that a lot of these legacy cities are facing economic conditions outside their control. They're facing a loss of industry and population loss. So what's been going on in some of in your experience to try to deal with that? Can you share any success stories? Let's start with Tony.
Yeah, thank you. So I don't know if we want to call this a success story, but more of how we've responded to the loss, but then repopulation of other communities that are now a part of our community and being inclusive and thoughtful about how we bring them into the fold. So Lorraine at one point had, in the 90s, I mean, it was, we had a huge steel mill or steel plant at its height, maybe employed about 10,000 people. And then also had the Ford Motor Company here. And I remember like in 96, I think Ford relocated, and over time, our steel mill has just gone idle, right? And so when you lose that amount of jobs, it obviously impacts your tax base, it impacts your population, but also people who serve on whether it's city councils, that serve on school boards, nonprofit organizations. I mean, you lose you have sort of a brain drain, right? And talent just looks differently. But what we have had is sort of this influx of African Americans as well as Puerto Ricans. In fact, Lorraine City has the second highest percentage of Puerto Ricans in our community, second to, like per capita, second to New York City, right? And in our public schools now, today, Puerto Rican students make up the majority of our schools, right? And so, and Lorraine was just a place where families could come in and get jobs, right? And I think culturally, just having that safe space, having community, having connection, and having, you know, city institutions, public institutions that respond to their culture makes us a place for that community to live and grow, right? And so while we have had loss, we've had another, like I say, influx of different racial minorities, and watching the city adapt and be more mindful. You know, from the time I was even in high school to now, I mean, you go places and there's a lot of bilingual, maps or just public wayfinding, and you go into the schools. I mean, you call places, they have, you know, press 1 for English, press 2 for like Spanish. Like we've never had that in our community. So seeing a community embrace how it looks and who's there now culturally, it's been phenomenal. And then, you know, really quickly in terms of the job loss, I've watched the city really be strategic about supporting micro entrepreneurs, partner with our small business development centers, and really saying, you know what, we may not, have employers that are here to hire our way out of this, but then how do we create an environment for entrepreneurs to flourish, right? Because even in the third quarter of last year in the pandemic, right, I think 30% of all new jobs were small businesses, right? So how do we create environments for entrepreneurs, small businesses to flourish, knowing that we're not going to attract the Amazons, the huge corporations. So that's just an example of how we've responded to laws, how we've adapted, but also been thoughtful about building an economy that supports entrepreneurship.
Okay, thank you. Jason, what's happening in Akron?
So the issue of population decline is certainly near and dear to my heart. You know, like a lot of our cities, Akron's lost about a third of its population. We peaked at 290,000 in 1960, and we're at a shade under 200,000 right now. And I mentioned in my opening remarks that one of Mayor Horrigan's lodestars is to grow the city's population again. And he adopted a bold goal of 250,000 people by 2050. And I think that was really important. You know, I mentioned earlier about a little bit of the fatalism and managed decline philosophy that can happen. Like Ian said, every city is at a different place. And I don't want to come across as like completely dismissing that strategy, because I think there are a lot of times you do have to do a lot of triage and be realistic. But, you know, when we look at our housing market, what we realized is despite a lot of population loss in Akron, first and foremost, a lot of it has been shrinking household size. So we went for about 40 years without losing any households, even though we lost a lot of people. And what we really lost was a lot of middle-class population and wealth. And one of the points that I always make to people is it's not just chasing a number. You know, the city's lost a third of its people. Everybody on this panel will be quick to tell you we have not lost a third of our costs. So we're still plowing the same number of streets. We're still fixing the same number of streets. We're still providing police and fire protection to the same 62 square miles that we were before. And the other thing that I always point out is most of the people went a couple miles away. So yes, a lot of Northeast Ohioans are now down in Southwest Florida and other places, but a lot of them are, 5 miles away in our suburbs. So when we looked at where people who work in Akron live, for example, 81% of the people that make over $40,000 a year that work in Akron don't live in the city. So that was pretty low-hanging fruit for us. And I should mention too, the top of the strategy is simply to retain people who are here. So it's not just about attracting people back from the suburbs, but it is both. And what we really realized is it does come down to supply and demand. You know, what supply of existing housing do we have? Are our neighborhoods attractive? Are our city services competitive with suburban areas. And, we wanted to work on both of those things at once. So the tax abatement has been a big success. We went from 20, I think there were less than 20 housing units built in 2015 in the entire city of about 97,000 units. To this year, we have about 13 or 1,400 units either under construction or in the planning and design stage. And that's been really important. I think we're going to find in the 2020 census, we will probably lose, 1 or 2,000 people. I don't think we've quite turned it around yet, but if we only lose 1 or 2,000 people, that would be our lowest decade or our best decade of population loss since 1960. And we've seen the median sales price of a house in Akron go from 56,000 in 2015 to 97,000 this year. So I'm sure that is also just strengthening the market in general, but that's been pretty positive. So we are building more equity and wealth for existing residents as well.
Okay, thanks. Ian, what's happening in Youngstown? Same, different?
Sure. Yeah. Generally similar approaches, but I just perhaps go into a little more detail on how we do it in Youngstown. So, in all of these places you see downtown revitalization. My work is focused on neighborhoods. So, in terms of neighborhood stabilization and revitalization, that's our primary work to combat population loss and see population increase. So, our work at the Youngstown Neighborhood Development Corporation is really focused on stabilizing, particularly the city's, I would call them transitional neighborhoods. You may call them middle neighborhoods. And the work is really about the basics. You've heard all the panelists talk about what that is. First, that's our housing quality. And Jason's heard me say this, but almost all of our cities don't have market rate, market ready housing product. Even if a house is in good shape and repair, it has the 1960s pink tile bathroom, and it's not in a state that's modern and attractive. So what we do in terms of our work here is put together very detailed neighborhood plans, which require ongoing data collection and analysis. And we listen to residents first and foremost, as well as all of the partners, which is how our work functions. So at YNDC, our work is done with many partners, our county land bank, city government, banks, philanthropy, so many foundations that are able to enable us to assemble the resources we need to do all of these things. And what are the things that we do? So renovating vacant buildings, renovating commercial buildings, working with existing homeowners, particularly low-income homeowners that don't have the necessary resources to repair their homes, and doing the basics in the neighborhood in terms of infrastructure, whether that means upgrading the neighborhood park, the streets and sidewalks, planting trees, but really making attractive, decent places that, number one, residents that are already here want to stay. And then as we continue building the attractiveness of them, we're also repopulating. Jason hit on it. We do have a surplus of housing. When I started here, we had about 5,000 vacant units. That's down around about 1,500, which is still 1,500 too many. But through this process is how we bring more and more of those back to life. And every house, that's been offline that people are living in again, that's a win when we talk about population loss. So our work is really focused on stabilizing, particularly the city's middle neighborhoods, but even the city's stable neighborhoods, which is relative in a place like Youngstown, keeping those stable as well, and then over time growing them again.
Okay, good. That raises a interesting question in my mind. Now, we're hearing a lot about like revitalization in some of these legacy cities, especially in downtowns and close-in neighborhoods. What is the story there? What is happening in some of these cities? Maybe we can start with Allison and give us a Ohio-wide perspective on that.
Yeah, so we see many communities across the state wanting to strengthen their downtowns, and based on the research that we do both in Ohio and across the nation to bring back to the state, you never see a strong legacy city with a weak downtown, right? Like the downtown redevelopment and neighborhood redevelopment has to go in hand. But what we're seeing across the state is that Some communities are farther along and have really kind of assembled the right partners and players to make those investments in downtown, and others are still trying to figure out how to assemble that team. And because these markets are so weak, because there's just such distress, and frankly, the quality of the buildings in downtown and surrounding neighborhoods are range from fair to not great at all, right? You really have to have everyone all on the same team. And so I'm talking about local government, the private sector, philanthropy, financial institutions that's going to do the lending. And in many places, communities are assembling their own dollars to do redevelopment because the buildings are perceived as too risky to banks. And, that is because federal regulations sort of dictate how banks lend. And, we can have a different discussion about that. But this is what I mean about communities that are really trying to figure out solutions on their own and not looking externally to force to be saved per se, but really looking externally for the tools that they need. So downtowns and the close by neighborhoods present huge opportunities, but also frequently because of the type of building stock that it is, it creates a lot of challenges in terms of financing that return. It's possible, but it is getting harder to do. I mean, it's just harder to do. But Akron, Lorain, and Youngstown are great examples of where that is occurring, I think, successfully.
Okay, let's go in that order. Akron. Jason, tell us what's happening.
So I think a lot of the discussion about revitalization, sometimes like what I would call like a for lack of a better word, like a coastal narrative gets superimposed sometimes onto legacy cities. And a good friend and colleague of mine who's a pretty prolific blogger and thinker about legacy cities, Pete Saunders, I definitely recommend you check out his work. He talks about what he calls like a Rust Belt urbanism. And it's kind of the idea that we look at these cities in their own context. Because what I find sometimes in the discussion about revitalization is a lot of people, I think, with the best of intentions, want to kind of jump immediately to like, are there winners and losers in this revitalization? And of course, we should be thoughtful about that. But what I find, at least here on the ground in Akron, is, in a lot of revitalization efforts, I would argue they're pretty much just winners if we can get the revitalization to happen. I mean, I've lived, other than my 2-year stint in North Carolina for grad school, I've lived not only in the city of Akron my whole life, but basically the same neighborhood. And this is one of the, relatively more affluent neighborhoods in the city, but I've seen the slow march of retail, out of our neighborhood for, I hate to say it, almost 50 years now. And I think what we find is a lot of everyday Akronites, like sometimes there's this either a gentrification narrative or just even things that might be a little bit more germane in San Francisco or wherever else, where people will get into these almost academic or theoretical disputes about like, well, should we have a Chipotle or should it be a local business? And I can tell you just from being a resident and talking to residents, like a lot of people are just dying for that neighborhood retail of any kind. And I think sometimes people who academicize it, that's not going to be the right word, make it overly academic, is the thought that there's going to be this big class conflict or this social division over things, where in reality, a lot of people just like, they want a cup of coffee or they want a burrito or they want like a place that they could actually walk to and work. And so not that we shouldn't be cognizant of equity, we most certainly should be, but I think in a lot of cases, new housing, new retail, there in a lot of the places we're talking about, there's often little to no downside. And I think that's just an important thing to keep in mind.
Okay, Tony, what's happening in Lorain? Do you have any success stories to tell us or cautionary tales?
Yeah, quite a bit. Good things are happening, but I want to be really transparent that none of it's happened overnight, right? I mean, this has been work that has really been leveraged through existing administrations at City Hall, City Councils, different business partners and community, private business owners, as well as our finance bank community, philanthropy. And so I'll just start with cleaning up the Black River and being able to work with NOACA, which is our Northeast Ohio area coordinating agency to leverage grants from NOACA, also leverage some grants from the EPA around the brownfield, cleaning up the site, which ultimately led to a development of a huge stadium and just a park along the Black River that attracts thousands of people in the summer around concerts and festivals. And then as you started getting more people coming down, over time, we developed, it was a developer came in and worked with some community block grant dollars, philanthropy supported, and was able to get an old hotel and renovate that hotel, worked with a business, private business owner who was still owned the property, had various nuisance issues with the city, got it really cheap and was able to like revitalize that location. And now we have a hotel downtown Lorraine, which we haven't had since I've been, I don't know, I was like 8 or 9 when that, so like 30 years ago, right? And so that led to, again, we at the foundation made investments in our Palace Theater to like really stabilize it, make sure that it was strong and that it had the right structure, and just a whole weatherization process we went through with the Palace Theater for them to start to attract, and be an anchor around the arts and civic engagement. And then you started seeing different other businesses pop up. And interestingly, when you look at cities like Elyria or Lorraine, they've also attracted some of our nonprofit organizations downtown, like the United Way, or you look at the Lorraine County Health and Dentistry, which is downtown Elyria now, and that generates foot traffic, which also supports the local entrepreneurs who have restaurants that have opened up downtown. So you're seeing restaurants and different shops open up, and this is the most like, how can I put it, vibrant our downtown has been in quite some time. But again, this has happened over time. It's happened from alignment of resources and investments with nonprofits, corporate, community, and city government and philanthropy, and just being intentional about that. And again, back to a point you made, Jason, about winners and losers. And what I've come to really appreciate is the idea of people really wanting functional quality city services, right? And when you think about the pressure that cities are under to generate revenue that ultimately supports those city services, especially in places where they don't have the huge access to companies that can tax, or workers that they can tax to support city services. When a Chipotle pops up, they're not saying, hey, don't open up right there at Chipotle. They're saying, yo, let's get us a Chipotle there. How do we open up a pharmacy or something else in that community, use a TIF, special financing, to like beautify or update the quality of the roads and water lines and walkways. So again, just being really intentional about investments that are already happening organically in your community, and then building upon those investments strategically.
So Ian, last time I was in Youngstown, I stayed in a Hilton right in downtown, had a nice meal, went out for a couple of drinks, even stopped in an art gallery. So it sounds like you're having some successes in downtown Youngstown. Can you talk about how that came about and whether or not you think that's gaining some momentum?
Yeah, sure. I'll just say really the downtown's come alive. When I was a kid, it was a ghost town. I only went downtown to go to the Y, where I learned to swim and play basketball. But what I'd really like to say too on this question of who benefits, I really think those are tough questions, particularly when you look at it, a place like Youngstown that is very much resource depleted, and we're looking specifically at public dollars. For example, there's about 12 million in public funds put into an amphitheater downtown. So, I think when you ask who benefits, those are fair questions. And when you really have limited resources, I think for me, there's some tension there, because really all of our neighborhood parks suck. So would that 12 million have gone to benefit kids that really don't have access to downtown on a daily basis, so they could have world-class neighborhood parks where they could be active and healthy? So those are important questions. I don't think there's necessarily easy answers to any of them, but I think the fewer the resources are, I think the tougher those questions become, and that you really have to have a thoughtful strategy about how you're using your limited resources and who is benefiting from that. And it does need to be part of an overall strategy. And Youngstown, downtown's really at the point where it's starting to take care of itself, surprisingly, but there has been quite a bit of public investment, something that we need to transition more significantly to our neighborhoods and its infrastructure.
Yeah, that's so we just talked about like who benefits from like revitalization in some of these legacy cities. So the next speaker in our series, Alan Malik, in his book Divided Cities, he talks about the growing social polarization in legacy cities. Can you address? Can our speakers address that? Let's start with Jason. Um, do you see that happening in Akron? More of social polarization over time because of some success stories, but really lagging in other neighborhoods, or what are you doing about that?
Sure. Well, first off, I wanted to let everybody know that I'm a huge Alan Malik fanboy, and it's great that he's coming to speak. I think he's a font of wisdom about a lot of these issues, and far more than I could ever be. But um, I think it's another one of those issues often that I think sometimes in the analysis that people do about the cities and in the polarization that people forget is sometimes people only look at the central city when the reality is each of these cities that we're talking about in Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, New York, Pennsylvania, wherever we are part of a larger region, and the majority of the population lives outside of the city limits. And and this is maybe related to my previous comment about the coastal narrative to some degree, but what I find sometimes is the focus solely becomes on the central city for solving all the problems of inequity, whether that's racial injustice or disparities in income. And all those issues, of course, are thorny and intertwined with one another in complicated ways. But I really would like, and I don't have a silver bullet of how to address it. Unfortunately, it's probably not a surprise to anybody here, but I think we do need to look at a lot of these issues holistically across the entire county or the entire region. And just one quick example. So I've written a little bit about this. Like there's a lot in the zeitgeist right now about zoning reform. And like I am totally on board with zoning reform. Like most of our zoning codes are antiquated. But what I find is like a lot of the discussion about single family zoning tends to focus almost monolithically on the central cities when the reality is pretty much anywhere in the US and most certainly here in the Great Lakes and Ohio Valley regions, you're going to find the most diverse zoning in the central city. And while it could always be improved, sometimes these analyses don't get very systemic and don't really look at, is there any single family zoning in some of the neighboring suburbs? Or, if you have 5-acre lot minimum, by definition, you're excluding pretty much anyone who can't afford to build a home on a 5-acre lot. So I think that when we talk about issues of equity and bridging gaps economically or racially and in other social ways as well, it's important to not just stop the conversation at the city limits, but to really look regionally. And again, I don't have a great suggestion on how to do that, but I think the first step is recognizing that some of the problems and challenges in the central city are not just caused by the management of the central city, but they're issues that transcend political unit boundaries.
Tony, you direct a foundation, so you must have a good perspective on this. What are you seeing in legacy cities and polarization and the increasing needs of some families and neighborhoods?
Yeah, I'll give 2 examples. First being school districts, right? So in the city of Lorraine, for example, there are about 6 school districts in our community. So there's about 12 to 14,000 school age kids, but about 6 different school districts in the one to the far west, which has seen the most development and a lot of tax abatements there. So a lot of 10, 15-year tax abatements to attract, those with middle-class families that can afford to live in those neighborhoods, live in the city of Lorraine, but they're Amherst School District, which is a more affluent community and has a stronger public school district. So obviously, as we all know, or may not know, I don't want to assume that everyone knows these issues, but, and I apologize for that. Property taxes, our local property taxes are used to support our public schools, but because those families live in those areas, like where they're in a city but send their kids to the neighboring school district. While we're able to tax the income of those families, we're not taxing the property, so that property doesn't come to the city school district. So when you see a Lorain City School District that's under state takeover, one of three districts, Lorain and Youngstown, I think, we think about the lack of resources that we don't have for the school district because those dollars are being outsourced to another community because of tax abatements, right? So should you not give the tax abatements on the homes to attract people to move to the community so that you can support the schools, or is it something in between? Those are challenging questions and decisions to make. I think another example, what we find here in our community is, and in a lot of communities, is where you have smaller cities that are experiencing capital flight. I'll give an example of a I won't say the city because you may know the business I'm talking about, and I never want to put anyone on the spot. There's a company that left one legacy city and went to a more suburban, city about 10 to 15 minutes away. And with that, that neighboring suburban community was able to, I think, offer about I think it was a 90% tax break over 14 years, right? And so to the city of Elyria, for example, it would cost them about 1.5 million in income tax revenue loss, right, annually. So what they had to do is, with this being their largest employer, they've been over the years slowly increasing, trying to absorb that loss, to slowly increasing the cost, or slowly increasing the income tax rate on workers who work in the city, but also reducing the credit for those who live in the city but work in neighboring communities. So what's happening is that you're creating, competition amongst the municipalities around where should I live, where I'm going to be taxed most, and should I work here? And as we know, some individuals and families don't have mobility and can't work or live where, or can't work or live where they want.
Uh-oh, looks like we lost Tony here for a second.
Or he's frozen. Well, sorry, Tony, if you suddenly jump in. Maybe I'll turn over to you, Allison, to wrap up this question before we go to audience Q&A. Can you give us a policy perspective on this issue of social polarization, regentrification?
Yeah, I mean, so I'll just say, so Great Ohio works on place, not people issues. We have to, we have to divide the world somehow, and that's how we divide the world. So I say this unofficially, but I would say that the biggest issue that we see in our cities around this polarization question is that low-income people are very, very low income because their wages and their wages are too low, and that that they can't build that equity like Jason's talking about in homes, right? So whenever we were talking about polarization and increasing market strength, and then there's these, in my mind, fairly unproductive conversations about gentrification in legacy cities, I think we need to remember that our markets need to be strengthened. And as Jason pointed out, right, families can be building equity in homes that they've been in for a long time. The problem is that, yes, there are Ohioans that are getting left behind. That is because their wages are not keeping up and they're not in sustainable wages, right? That is the issue in Ohio. The issue is not that our markets are too hot. I would just, and I'm happy to continue to debate that, but I feel pretty strongly about that point because anxiety about gentrification feels like a real red herring here in Ohio in most places. Not all places, but most.
Okay, thanks. Tony, did you want to finish your thought before we go to audience Q&A? We kind of lost you for a few seconds there.
Now I want to be mindful of the audience. They've been waiting and being talked to, so I would love to let them join us.
Okay, Katie, some questions from the audience.
Yeah, we have a ton of great questions. So the first one I'm going to ask is, someone would like to hear about what role public libraries have that can play into strengthening legacy cities.
So I have a quick example. I'll take 60 seconds. When the city of Elyria's public library was looking to put on a levy to build a new library, one of the things they did is they looked at sites downtown Elyria, which again is a part of a strategy to bring foot traffic and bring people downtown. And so they built downtown. Lorraine's public library is downtown, and I think our library has they've become libraries without walls, right? So now they're taking on different roles in communities, especially in our legacy cities. I mean, our libraries are starting programs and partnerships with our food banks. We're looking at food insecurity in food deserts. They we've actually invested in our like hotspots and what else do we have there? I mean, you name it, it's there. I'm thinking of, I can't think of the exact word. I'm having a moment, but I'll just say this: libraries are great institutions with a lot of connections to people that allows them, to really dial in. So here's the example. So there's a partnership with Lorain County Metropolitan Housing Authority, LMHA. I was told not to use acronyms here. So, there was an issue around broadband and connectivity to people who lived in public housing, and our library launched that, right, in support. All right, so there's so many different things that libraries can do, and they've served as conveners. They bring in Idea Stream or the City Club to have conversations of of public matter, right? So they've gone from being just a place where people went to check out books to being really a part of our civic fabric.
Okay, let's go next question, Katie.
Okay, let's see. Many of the legacy cities developed under the auto building industry. It is not likely that that will come back. What can the state do to attract new industries to Ohio?
So I'll jump in here, but I'd like to hear folks on the ground what they say. So I think the strategy of tapping untapped assets, particularly around human capital. So what I mean is helping our existing residents thrive as business owners and as successful employees. I think that's a huge thing, right? I think we also need to recognize that a diverse economy allows communities to absorb impacts to that economy more successfully than a sort of monolithic economy. So more investments in small business development, providing the financing needed, the risk tolerant financing needed for companies and businesses to get off the ground. And also I think just making this a priority, right? So Jobs Ohio does great work, but they are really constrained by the mission that was originally set out for them, which is to focus on these target types of industries and connecting Jobs Ohio's work with workforce development entities continues to be an ongoing process. So I would just say that I think that there's a lot that the state can do. I also think that there's a lot that individual communities at the local level need to be doing to better tie together these very good faith efforts, but sometimes they're working in silos.
Anyone else?
I might just add one thing on that. I think sometimes the discussions around, and I've seen this evolve especially over the last, I don't know, 6, 7 years. Sometimes the discussions around attracting manufacturing or industrial development, I think it's another one of those red herring conversations sometimes where the two choices that are portrayed are either manufacturing as it existed in 1955 or everyone's going to learn to code. And I'm over exaggerating just a little bit. And I think the reality, and this is a personal, view of mine, feel free to disagree, but I think it was a horrendous mistake for the United States to outsource as much manufacturing as it has. I think people did it with a lot of good intentions. I also won't argue that automatically means that it all comes back to Ohio. If it comes back, I mean, a lot of it went to the South, right? Like all of our rubber factories in Akron, they didn't go to China. They went to Alabama and South Carolina and Texas. But I do think it's an important national policy conversation. And just, I'll stop here, but I don't even think it's just a state issue. It certainly is a state issue. And how can Ohio be more competitive? But I think it is something that the White House and Congress have to grapple with of, we saw that with the pandemic. We couldn't even manufacture masks and basic supplies that we need. So I do hope that, with the Biden administration, that we do get into a substantive national policy discussion. And I do think if we do, move toward restoring some manufacturing in the U.S., Ohio is pretty well positioned to possibly take advantage of that.
Okay, maybe one last question, Katie. We're got about 5 minutes left.
Yeah, we had a question. Basically, it boils down to what suggestions are being made in systems of support to help promote meeting the basic needs of these families living within legacy cities.
I'm happy to respond to that at least briefly. I mean, that's kind of what our work's all about. So like I said, it starts with the residents first. So stabilizing people's housing, so particularly low-income people that don't necessarily have the financial resources. We also offer financial counseling, housing counseling, so working with people one-on-one long-term. We also operate a program called Double Up in our 2 counties here in the Mahoning Valley that provides an incentive for SNAP users to purchase healthy food and doubles the amount that they can buy. So getting people, again, fresh, healthy food. So those are 2 examples. There's many more, but also just generally improving neighborhoods too. I think a lot of our work is focused on the social determinants of health. So often we see people of color, low-income people living in neighborhoods where they just can't be healthy even if they want to because of the built environment, because of lack of access, because of all these things. So, and the flow of capital, whatever. So that's kind of what our work is about. It's definitely a slow incremental process, but I think that's a good question, and that's definitely where you have to start from.
And I'll jump in really quickly. Obviously, at our foundation, we support a lot of the nonprofits. And one of the things that we do outside of just direct funding is really be thoughtful about how are we connecting those issues to City Hall and government, right? Or our county commissioners, just because there's so many public dollars, again, that comes into our community. And how can we, as a foundation, be an advocate for some of those families and their basic needs? So food, clothing, like housing, shelter, education, access to education, transportation, workforce. And so I think there's something to be said about how communities have used community block grant dollars in different ways now to support basic needs. We've also, for example, like CARES Act dollars that have come from the federal government that are being used to support basic needs, I think has been eye-opening for some municipalities who have never had to think about ways to fund people who live on the margins of our communities, right? So when we think about the pandemic and the amount of people whose health benefits were tied to their employment that don't no longer have that employment or those health benefits, and now leveraging our free clinics, our federally qualified health centers, right? So there's this huge influx of people who have never been a part of these systems. And I think as we move forward 2, 3, 5 years from now, we're going to continue to see a need for government to step up and find ways to partner with foundations and nonprofits to meet the basic needs of our communities, because that population has grown and been exacerbated by COVID-19 and the pandemic.
That's a really interesting point. Silver lining out of this is that it's shown us the weaknesses and the faults in our societies and cities that we have to try to shore up now. We only have about a minute or 2 left, so maybe Allison and Jason, in that order, could just give us their comments on this question, or maybe a wrap-up statement.
I'll just say that we think that there's a tremendous opportunity in Ohio, and that that our legacy cities are great building blocks for the future. I see that there's a couple questions that have been coming in about like how can legacy cities work together, and we do think that that is a winning strategy here at the state level and federal level. So that's some of the work that we do at Greater Ohio. I know more informally that Jason, Tony, and Ian are participating in peer networks and mentor networks, and I think that I think, like I said, I think there's tremendous opportunity here in Ohio. I think also that it's important that we continue to raise up the fact that there are many, many more legacy cities in our country than there are prospering cities, right? And that making sure that that becomes part of the national narrative, I think would really change things. That's a long-term goal, of course.
Okay, Jason, the final word from Akron.
Well, it's a lot of pressure to do the final word, but I think that one thing that I might just leave you with that we haven't really talked too much about, but is related to what was just said is I think the future of legacy cities post-COVID is a really important topic. I mean, my personal view on the pandemic is that obviously it was a hugely and is a hugely disruptive social and economic in addition, of course, to public health issue. But I think it was also a catalyst for exposing a lot of systemic weaknesses in our society, whether they're political, social, economic, et cetera, that I honestly think we'll be living with the fallout from for the rest of our lives, and hopefully can address some of those challenges. But I think the opportunity for legacy cities is, I do think that the pandemic and its fallout has changed the narrative a little bit on the superstar cities. And, I'm not going to prognosticate about, I can assure you there will be a New York City and a San Francisco, into the future. But I do think that some of the sheen has come off of those cities with this, and that there is a renewed interest in, mid-sized places that are affordable and provide some maybe unappreciated quality of life benefits. So not that I'm not suggesting that everyone will automatically move from Seattle to Akron. I wish it were so, but I do think that the competitive, the game board has maybe been reshuffled a little bit, and that if we do work together and implement some of the best practices that everyone on this panel has talked about, I think we can set ourselves up for success better than maybe we could have a couple of years ago.
Okay, you respond well to pressure, Jason. That was a really good wrap-up statement. I want to thank all the panelists for an excellent discussion. I had really high expectations for this panel, and you not only met them, but exceeded them. Thank you very much. And audience, thank you for your time. And remind you, please join us on Friday, February 12th for Alan Malik, Divided City, and Strong Towns with Charles Marone on Friday, March 12th. Cura.osu.edu has all the information you need. Have a good Friday. Have a good weekend. Thank you, everyone. Stay safe, stay healthy.